Another day, another story. Fires were nothing out of the ordinary on Cleveland's Cuyahoga River in the 1960s. The city was still a manufacturing hub, and the river, which empties into Lake Erie, had long been a dumping place for sewage and industrial waste. Welcome to Tabo Eminent Channel. The creation of the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, EPA, was largely influenced by the Cuyahoga River fire rather than a shocking river fire. The Cuyahoga River fire in 1969, which occurred in Cleveland, Ohio, attracted national attention as it symbolized the pollution issues plaguing American water bodies at the time. The river had caught fire multiple times due to industrial pollutants and oil slicks. The incident helped galvanize public and political support for environmental protection measures. Subsequently, in 1970, President Richard Nixon signed an executive order establishing the EPA to address and regulate environmental issues comprehensively. But on June 22, 1969, a spark flared from the train tracks down to the river below, igniting industrial debris floating on the surface of the water. Flames spread across the river, in some places reaching 5 stories high. And though it only took about 20 minutes to extinguish the blaze, the not-so-unusual river fire helped create an environmental revolution. Though it initially caught the attention of few Cleveland residents, the Cuyahoga River fire stoked the rest of the nation's awareness of the environmental and health threats of river pollution, and fueled a growing movement that culminated in the creation of the Environmental Protection Agency. Cleveland had staked its claim as an industrial center in the 19th century, when the Civil War turned the then small city into a manufacturing powerhouse. As factories and the local population grew, sewage and industrial remnants poured into the river. But, in line with the era's lax attitudes toward the environment, nobody much cared. Soon, the river was filthy. Yellowish-black rings of oil circled on its surface like grease in soup, recalled František Vlasik, a Czech immigrant, of his first view of the river in the 1880s. The water was yellowish, thick, full of clay, stinking of oil and sewage. Piles of rotting wood were heaped on either bank of the river, and it was all dirty and neglected. I was disappointed by this view of an American river. At the time, according to the Property and Environment Research Center, Cleveland sourced its drinking water from Lake Erie and used the river as a sewer. So municipal authorities left the Cuyahoga River alone, allowing firms along its banks to discharge into it at will, they write. The waste those firms did discharge turned the river muddy and filled it with oil, solvents and other industrial products. Between 1868 and 1952, it burned 9 times. The 1952 fire racked up $1.5 million in damage. But by most, occasional fires and pollution were seen as the cost of industry, a price no one was willing to dispute. When fire broke out on the river again in 1969, it seemed like business as usual. Most Clevelanders seemed not to care a great deal, write environmental historians David Stradling and Richard Stradling. Far too many problems plagued the city for residents to get hung up on a little fire. The '69 fire didn't represent the culmination of an abusive relationship between a city and its environment. It was simply another sad chapter in the long story of a terribly polluted river. But attitudes toward the environment had changed since the last river fire. In the years before the fire, Rachel Carson published Silent Spring, which became a bestseller and opened the eyes of many Americans to the danger of DDT and other pesticides. Congress had begun passing laws to boost air quality and protect endangered species. And a growing counterculture had begun to embrace sustainability as people experimented with back-to-the-land subsistence farming and communal living. Another factor was at play, an enormous oil spill in Santa Barbara, California that sent 3 million gallons of oil into the Pacific Ocean. Suddenly, people's televisions and newspapers featured images of oil-slicked birds and dead dolphins. Outraged and shocked, citizens mobilized to clean up beaches and lobby oil companies not to pollute. Never in my long lifetime have I ever seen such an aroused populace at the grassroots level, said Thomas Stork, a Santa Barbara news editor. The oil pollution has done something I have never seen before in Santa Barbara. It has united citizens of all political persuasions in a truly nonpartisan cause. Soon, cries for regulation of water pollution became a roar. A grand jury investigation of the causes of the fire followed, as did coalition efforts to clean up the Great Lakes. It even inspired plans for a national environmental teach-in, an event that would become the first Earth Day. In early 1970, President Richard Nixon called for sweeping environmental reform. He created a Council on Environmental Reform which, shortly afterward, was consolidated into the Environmental Protection Agency. In 1972, Congress overrode Nixon's veto to pass the Clean Water Act, which created national water quality standards. Though the Cuyahoga River fire did not directly lead to the formation of the EPA, it was an important landmark for a burgeoning environmental movement. Today, the river is no longer stagnant or filthy. Public and private efforts have diverted sewage and cleaned up its banks. According to the National Park Service, the river still has unhealthy amounts of sewage in some areas. But in March 2019, the Ohio EPA announced that its fish are now safe to eat. Whether or not the river ever overcomes the remainder of its environmental challenges, the memory of the 1969 fire will continue to mobilize those intent on protecting the natural world. A local story gains international attention. The 1969 fire did not surprise Clevelanders. The river had burned more than 10 times over the previous century. The first newspaper coverage focused on the damage, not the fact that the river had burned. At the time, people largely saw the river a part of industrial infrastructure. In that light, a river fire seemed more normal. It is when we view a river as a natural system that a fire seems out of place. Almost immediately, the narrative began to change. The fire took place on a Sunday. On Monday, June 23, Cleveland Mayor Carl Stokes led local press on a pollution tour of the river. Betty Kloritz, one of nation's first full-time environmental reporters, covered the tour for the Cleveland Press. She had been writing about the Save Lake Erie Now campaign for several years. On August 1, Time magazine featured Mayor Stokes and the fire in a new section on the environment. The article described the Cuyahoga as the river that oozes rather than flows and in which a person does not drown but decays. From there, other national and international outlets picked up the story. Remembering the fire. The tide of public opinion about pollution changed in 1970. This led to the first Earth Day in April and the establishment of the Environmental Protection Agency in December. A flurry of environmental activism and legislation followed, including the Clean Water Act of 1972. Some say that the 1969 fire was the direct cause, but is that correct? The real story is complex. Changes were already in motion. Nationally, the Water Pollution Control Act of 1965 had become law. Locally, Cleveland voters had passed a $100 million bond issue in 1968 for sewer construction and water treatment plant upgrades to protect Lake Erie. In 1969, the media paid more attention to a major oil spill in Santa Barbara, California. Months later, the river fire was yet another reminder of how bad things had become. And yet the Santa Barbara spill is largely forgotten while the 1969 Cuyahoga River fire became world famous. It often appears in textbooks about the environmental movement. It was part of negative jokes about Cleveland that were popular in the 1970s. Today, Burning River is used in the names of events, beers, and hot sauces. Thanks for watching. Request you to subscribe the channel.